The Ghosts of the Past. The morning of September 28, 2024, dawned gray and overcast, a reflection of the sorrow that had weighed on Laura Calloway's heart for nearly 3 decades. The world outside her window had changed in so many ways, but inside, in the deepest corners of her mind, she remained frozen in time, trapped in the moment her daughter, Rory, disappeared. It had been 27 years since that fateful school trip. A field trip that was meant to be a fun learning experience had instead turned into a waking nightmare. The entire 5th grade class of Crescent Ridge Elementary, 14 children in total, along with their teacher, Mr. Gregory, and an accompanying staff member, had disappeared without a trace. No bodies, no evidence, no explanation. Authorities had scoured the region, the case making headlines for years. They had suspected foul play. But with no solid leads, the case eventually turned cold. Theories circulated: kidnapping, human trafficking, a tragic accident. But nothing ever led to the truth. Parents were left in limbo, grieving without closure. Some tried to move on. Others, like Laura, never could. The pain was a slow, suffocating thing that had wrapped around her heart and refused to let go. Laura ran a trembling hand through her graying hair as she sat at her small dining table, staring at an old photograph of her daughter. Rory had been just 10 years old when she vanished, full of life, her hazel eyes twinkling with mischief. Laura had memorized every detail of that face. The weight of today, the anniversary of the disappearance, pressed down on her like an iron fist. Her phone buzzed, startling her. She reached for it, expecting it to be Helen Carter, her closest friend, and the only other person who truly understood her pain. Helen's daughter, Sally, had been in the same class as Rory. Instead, it was an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Calloway," a male voice asked. It was deep, familiar, yet strained. "Yes. Who is this?" "This is Officer Jensen. A pause. "I was the lead investigator on your daughter's case." Laura's breath hitched. She had tried to contact him in the past, but after the case had gone cold, he'd stopped answering. "Why are you calling me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A deep sigh. "I need to meet with you." Laura gripped the phone tighter. "Meet with me? After all these years? Why now?" There was a long silence before he spoke again, his voice graver this time. "Because I think we may have missed something, and I think it might change everything." A memory rekindled. Half an hour later, Laura sat across from Officer Jensen in a small coffee shop. His once dark hair was now streaked with gray, his face lined with years of burden. Jensen placed a worn manila folder between them. "I recently came across some old evidence from the case," he began. "Things that weren't examined properly. I was going through old case files, and I found this." He slid a faded photograph toward her. Laura's heart nearly stopped. It was a classed photo, taken just before the trip. Her eyes scanned the faces of the children. Rory was there, smiling, standing next to Sally. Mr. Gregory was at the back. Everything seemed normal. But then Laura's gaze shifted, and her stomach dropped. At the edge of the group stood Principal Lillian Brooks. "That can't be right," Laura murmured. "The principal didn't go on the trip. She stayed behind." Jensen nodded. "That's what we were told. But there she is, in the photo. And more importantly," he leaned in, his voice dropping, "she wasn't supposed to be there." A chill ran down Laura's spine. Why would she lie? "That's what we need to find out," Jensen said grimly. An unexpected visit. Hours later, Laura stood outside a modest 2-story house, her fists clenched at her sides. Principal Lillian Brooks lived here. For years, Laura had avoided contact with the woman. In the early days, she had seemed devastated by the tragedy, stepping down from her position shortly after the case went cold. But there had always been something off about her. Now, with this new revelation, Laura needed answers. She rang the doorbell. The seconds stretched on. Then finally, the door creaked open. Standing there was Lillian Brooks, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, partially obscured, was a younger woman. Laura's breath caught in her throat. There was something eerily familiar about her. Brooks' eyes widened in surprise. "Mrs. Calloway, what are you doing here?" Laura swallowed hard. "I need to ask you about that school trip." For a brief moment, something flickered in the older woman's gaze. Then she smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Liar." Laura took a step forward. "The police found a picture. You were there that day." Brooks' fingers tightened on the doorframe. I don't recall." But the younger woman behind her let out a small, almost involuntary gasp. Laura's gaze snapped to her. "You," Laura whispered. "I know you, don't I?" The woman hesitated, then took a small step forward. Her hands trembled. She began, her voice breaking. Brooks quickly turned to her. "Go inside." Her voice was tight, laced with something dangerous. But the woman didn't move. Instead, she looked at Laura with an expression so filled with pain that it made her stomach churn. Then, softly, she spoke 3 words that shattered Laura's world. "I knew Rory." Laura felt the ground tilt beneath her. Jensen had been right. Something had been missed. Something terrible. And the truth was finally beginning to emerge. The woman in the shadows. The name that shouldn't exist. Laura Calloway's world seemed to stop. The young woman standing behind Principal Lillian Brooks had just whispered words that shattered the foundation of everything Laura had believed for nearly 3 decades. "I knew Rory." Laura felt her breath catch in her throat, her pulse roaring in her ears. The weight of those 3 words pressed down on her chest, and for a moment she could barely form a coherent thought. "You." Laura's voice broke. "What did you just say?" The woman hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the doorway. Her wide, uncertain eyes flickered to Principal Brooks, who looked absolutely petrified. Lillian's face had drained of all color. "Audrey," she said in a sharp, warning tone. "Audrey." The name sent a violent shudder through Laura. There was no way this woman could be Audrey Whitman. Audrey Whitman had been one of the missing students. She had been 10 years old, just like Rory. Her name was etched onto one of the empty graves at the cemetery. And yet here she was, alive. Laura's hands clenched into fists. "Who are you?" she demanded, stepping forward. "How do you know my daughter?" The young woman, Audrey, shook her head quickly, stepping back as if she had already said too much. But there was something broken in her eyes, a lifetime of pain and regret. "She doesn't know what she's saying," Lillian cut in sharply, attempting to move between them. "She's confused. I think you should leave, Mrs. Calloway." But Laura wasn't leaving. Not now. She took another step forward, her chest rising and falling with deep, steadying breaths. "You lied to me," she said to Lillian. "For 27 years, you let us believe that all of our children had disappeared. You let us believe there was no hope." "I didn't lie," Lillian hissed. Her voice shook, and Laura could see her grasping for control. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Laura's gaze flickered back to Audrey, who was standing frozen, her eyes darting toward the street like she was considering running. Laura realized she only had one chance. "If you knew Rory," she said, her voice trembling with desperation, "then tell me, where is she?" A silence stretched between them. The whole world seemed to shrink in that moment. Audrey's lip quivered. She inhaled shakily, and then, finally, she spoke. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can't." Something inside Laura broke. She had spent 27 years living in the unknown. 27 years waking up every morning hoping for a call that never came, praying for an answer that never arrived. And now, here she was, standing in front of someone who might finally hold the truth. And she was refusing to speak. Laura's voice turned cold. "Then I'm calling the police." Lillian visibly stiffened, and Audrey's entire face twisted in fear. No, Audrey said quickly. Please don't. Why not? Laura pressed. What are you afraid of? She's not afraid, Lillian snapped. She's trying to protect people. Laura scoffed, the rage rising in her chest. Protect who? You? The people who took my daughter. Who took all of those kids. Audrey suddenly reached out and grabbed Laura's wrist. The touch was unexpected, gentle, but firm. Please, she whispered, barely audible. Meet me later. Away from here. I'll tell you everything. Lillian turned on her sharply. Audrey. No. Audrey's voice trembled, but there was a hint of steel behind it now. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending. Laura's heart pounded. Lillian was still fuming, her lips pressed into a thin line. But she didn't stop Audrey as she slipped a small folded piece of paper into Laura's palm. Then Audrey turned, disappearing back into the house, and Lillian quickly slammed the door. A secret meeting in the dark. Laura stared at the crumpled paper in her hand, her fingers trembling. She carefully unfolded it, her breath hitching as she read the hastily scribbled note. Midnight, Crescent Ridge Cemetery. Come alone. Her stomach twisted. Why would Audrey want to meet in the cemetery? What was she afraid of? Laura knew she had no choice. If there was even the slightest chance that Audrey knew the truth about what had happened to Rory, she had to go. That night, Laura found herself gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckle tension as she parked just outside the cemetery gates. The place was eerily quiet, the thick fog rolling in from the hills making it seem almost otherworldly. The air was cold and damp, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of the trees in the wind. Her heart pounded as she stepped onto the gravel path, the crunching beneath her feet unnervingly loud in the silence. She had walked these grounds countless times to visit Rory's empty grave, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, it felt like the dead were watching. A figure stepped out of the darkness. Laura's breath caught. Audrey. She was standing near the row of gravestones, wrapped in a long coat, her posture tense as she glanced around nervously. She looked scared. Laura wasted no time. Tell me the truth, she said. What happened to my daughter? Audrey swallowed hard. Her breath came out in shaky puffs in the cold air. You have to understand, she whispered. I was a child. I didn't know. I didn't understand what was happening until it was too late. Laura's nails dug into her palms. What happened? Audrey hesitated. Then, her voice barely above a whisper, she said, The trip, it was never supposed to happen. Laura frowned. What do you mean? Audrey's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't a school trip. It was a cover-up. A way to get us all in one place so they could take us. A sick feeling washed over Laura. Who? She asked, her voice barely steady. Audrey shook her head. The people who paid for us. Laura's stomach turned violently. You mean human trafficking? Audrey nodded, a broken sob escaping her lips. I don't remember everything. It's blurry. But I remember the bus ride. I remember how it never stopped at the park. I remember waking up in a place I didn't recognize with people I didn't know. They separated us. She exhaled shakily. And then, they took Rory. Laura's knees nearly buckled. Where? Audrey shook her head again, her expression tormented. I don't know. I never saw her again. Laura felt her world crumble. 27 years of pain, and this was all she had. No concrete answers, just a vague confirmation of her worst fears. Tears burned in her eyes. Why didn't you come forward before? Why didn't you tell someone? Because, Audrey whispered, her voice laced with terror, they're still watching. The words sent ice through Laura's veins. Before she could ask anything else, headlights flashed in the distance. Audrey's eyes widened in fear. I have to go, she said quickly, backing away. Don't follow me. Don't look for me again. Laura grabbed her arm. Wait. Who are they? Who's watching? But Audrey tore herself free and disappeared into the shadows. Laura turned back toward the road, her heart hammering. The headlights were getting closer. She wasn't alone. Someone else was here. Someone who didn't want the truth to come out. And now, they knew Laura was looking for it. Shadows in the dark. The watchers in the night. Laura Calloway stood frozen as the headlights cut through the thick fog, creeping toward her like the glowing eyes of a predator. Her breath hitched. Her fingers clenched into fists. Then, without hesitation, she ran. Her boots pounded against the damp earth as she dashed between the headstones, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She had spent years coming to this cemetery to grieve, to honor Rory's memory. Now she was running for her life. The vehicle pulled closer. She heard the low hum of an engine. A door creaked open. "Mrs. Calloway." The voice sent ice down her spine. It wasn't just anyone. It was him. Officer Jensen. Laura spun around, her chest heaving. "Jensen," she gasped. "What are you doing here?" The man stepped forward, his face obscured in the darkness. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, his voice steady, but edged with something she couldn't quite place. She hesitated. The police, were they involved? Had she just told the wrong person that Audrey was alive? Laura's mind raced. She had spent years begging the police to keep looking into the case, and now, the moment she got close to the truth, a cop conveniently showed up in the middle of the night. Something was wrong. Jensen took another step closer, his features now illuminated by the dim glow of the headlights. "Laura," he said in a softer tone, "get in the car." The words made her skin crawl. Every instinct screamed at her, "Do not get in the car." Her hands trembled as she forced herself to stay calm. "Why?" she asked. "What's going on?" Jensen exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if debating whether to tell her something. Then he leaned in slightly. "Because you're not the only one looking for Audrey Whitman." Laura felt her blood turn to ice. He knew. The realization nearly knocked the breath out of her. "Who?" she whispered. Jensen glanced over his shoulder, as if checking for something or someone. Then he lowered his voice. "You don't want to find out." Laura swallowed hard. "Are you telling me she's in danger?" Jensen's jaw tightened. "She's been in danger for 27 years. Laura felt her hands shaking. "Then why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you find her?" Jensen sighed. "Because I wasn't supposed to." The words lingered in the cold night air. Laura took a step back. "What does that mean?" Jensen hesitated. His eyes darted around, scanning the cemetery. Then, in a low, firm voice, he said, "There are people in high places who don't want the past uncovered. And right now, you're digging too deep." Laura's breath caught. "Who are they?" Jensen shook his head. "Go home, Laura." "No." Jensen's eyes darkened. "I'm serious," she said, stepping forward. "I have nothing left to lose. You think I'm going to stop now?" "Not when I finally found one of them alive." Jensen's entire body tensed. Laura watched as he clenched his fists, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "If you really want to know the truth." He glanced at the cemetery gate. "Follow the money." She frowned. "What?" Jensen took another cautious step forward. "Look into Crescent Ridge Elementary's finances before the trip." Laura felt her pulse race. "Why?" Jensen didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and slipped it into her hand. "Go home," he repeated. "And Laura." She swallowed. "Watch your back." Then, without another word, he turned, climbed back into his car, and drove away, leaving her standing in the darkness, clutching a piece of paper that might just change everything. The hidden files. Laura barely slept that night. She sat at her dining table, staring at the slip of paper Jensen had given her. An address. It wasn't a police station. It wasn't an office. It was a storage facility. Her heart pounded. Jensen was right. If someone had paid for those children to be taken, then there had to be a paper trail. And if he was telling her where to find it, then that meant one thing. The people behind this weren't just criminals. They were people in power. She had to move fast. By sunrise, she was driving to the storage facility. The place was old, dusty, and barely maintained. Rows of metal doors stretched down a narrow corridor, and the air smelled of rust and mildew. She found the unit Jensen had written on the paper. Her hand shook as she turned the key. The metal door groaned as it slid open. Inside, stacks of old school records filled the small, dimly lit space. She felt her breath hitch. These files should have been archived years ago. Why were they hidden here? Laura moved quickly, her fingers trembling as she pulled a dusty box from one of the shelves. She flipped through old ledgers, scanned financial reports, her eyes narrowing as she spotted something odd. 1 month before the trip, Crescent Ridge Elementary received an anonymous donation. A large one. Her heart pounded. She grabbed another file. And another. The pattern repeated. Every single year, the school had received suspiciously large donations. But the year of the trip, the amount was nearly triple the usual. Someone had funded that trip. Someone had paid for those children. Laura's hands trembled as she dug deeper. Then, at the bottom of one of the boxes, she found something that made her stomach churn. A list of names. Her fingers traced the ink, bile rising in her throat as she read. Students CELICTED. Every name was neatly typed. Her daughter's name was on the list. So was Audrey's. Her breath shuddered as her eyes flickered to the bottom of the page. And there, signed in delicate cursive, was a name she never expected to see. Lillian Brooks. Laura's blood ran cold. The principal hadn't just known about the trip. She had organized it. She had handpicked the children. And worst of all, she had sold them. Laura felt her entire body shake as the weight of the truth crashed over her. She had spent years searching for an answer. Now she finally had it. And she finally understood why Audrey was so afraid. The people who had taken their children weren't strangers. They had been in positions of power. People they had trusted. People who were still out there. And they knew she was looking for them. Laura's pulse thundered in her ears as she stumbled out of the storage unit, clutching the files against her chest. She had the truth now. But that meant one thing. She was next. Buried secrets and deadly lies. A target on her back. Laura Calloway gripped the stolen school files against her chest as she drove back toward her house, her heart pounding in her ears. She had spent 27 years searching for answers. Now she had them, and it had made her a target. The truth was worse than she had ever imagined. Crescent Ridge Elementary hadn't just lost her daughter and the other children on that school trip. They had been sold. Principal Lillian Brooks had personally signed off on a student selection list, a document proving that someone had paid for those children to be taken. And the money trail went deep. Someone powerful had funded it. Someone who had ties to the police, the school board, and maybe even beyond. Jensen had warned her. And now she understood why. She wasn't just chasing ghosts anymore. She was chasing monsters. And monsters didn't like to be found. Her fingers clenched the wheel. The roads leading back to her home were eerily empty. She was sure she hadn't been followed, but something in her gut told her that she wasn't safe. Not anymore. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed something strange. Her front door was slightly ajar. She hadn't left it open. The air in her lungs froze. Her hand shook as she reached into her glove compartment and pulled out a small pocket knife she kept for emergencies. She climbed out of the car, inching toward the house. The wind blew softly. The silence stretched thick around her. Someone had been here. And they might still be inside. She swallowed hard, pressing her back against the doorframe. Then, slowly, she nudged the door open with her foot. Inside, her living room was wrecked. Her couch cushions had been torn apart. Her bookshelves overturned. The drawers in her kitchen were yanked open, their contents scattered across the floor. Someone had been looking for something. They had been looking for her. A lump formed in her throat as she stepped inside. She moved cautiously, scanning the space for any signs of movement. But whoever had done this, they were already gone. Then she saw it. A single photo pinned to her refrigerator with a knife. It was a picture of Rory. Laura's heart stopped. At the bottom, in red ink, someone had scrawled a message. "Stop looking." Her blood turned to ice. Her fingers trembled as she reached up, carefully pulling the knife from the fridge. They knew. They knew she had the files. They knew she had seen the evidence. And they were warning her. A shudder racked through her body. For a moment, she considered calling Jensen. But what if he was compromised? He had helped her, sure, but he had also admitted that powerful people wanted this buried. Could she really trust him? She needed help, but not from the police. She needed someone who had as much to lose as she did. Someone who would fight alongside her. She needed Helen, the last hope. Helen Carter nearly dropped her mug of tea when she opened her front door and saw Laura standing there, her face pale, her hands clutching a folder so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Laura," Helen whispered, "what's wrong?" Laura stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. "They came to my house," she said, her voice shaking. Helen's breath hitched. "Who?" Laura thrust the folder onto the kitchen table, her eyes burning with barely contained rage. "The people who took our daughters." Helen froze. For 27 years, she had grieved her daughter, Sally, the same way Laura had grieved Rory. For 27 years, she had accepted the silence. But now, Laura was telling her that silence had been forced. Helen's trembling fingers reached for the folder. She flipped it open. And then she saw it. The list. The names of their children. The financial records. And at the very bottom, Lillian Brooks' signature. Helen's hands flew to her mouth. "Oh my God." Laura swallowed back the lump in her throat. "They sold them," she said hoarsely. "Someone paid for them." And Lillian knew. Helen's face twisted with disbelief. No, she couldn't have. She was devastated when it happened. She stepped down as principal. She didn't step down because she was grieving. Laura cut in sharply. She stepped down because she got caught up in something bigger than she could handle. Helen's eyes flickered to the folder again, scanning the evidence with mounting horror. And then, suddenly, something shifted in her expression. Something Laura hadn't seen in a long time. Determination. "What do we do?" Helen asked. Laura hesitated. She had spent years searching for answers. Now that she finally had them, she had no idea what to do next. But there was one thing she did know. They needed to find Audrey. And they needed to do it before the people watching them got to her first. A final warning. The next 24 hours were a blur. Laura and Helen tried everything they could to track down Audrey. But she had vanished. No phone calls. No trace. It was like she had disappeared all over again. By nightfall, Laura was back in her house, pacing in the dim light of her kitchen. The shadows in the corners felt too dark. The silence felt too heavy. She knew she was being watched. And she knew they weren't going to wait much longer. Then, at exactly midnight, her phone buzzed. A text. From an unknown number. Her breath hitched as she read it. "If you want to know where your daughter is, meet me at the old school. 1 a.m. Come alone." Her heart slammed against her ribs. Rory. For a moment, all the logic in her brain screamed at her to ignore it. It was a trap. It had to be. But if there was even the slightest chance, even the tiniest possibility, that Rory was alive, she had to go, no matter the cost. Laura grabbed her coat, stuffed the folder into her bag, and slipped out the door. The School of Nightmares. Crescent Ridge Elementary had been abandoned for years. The once bright playground was rusted and broken. The windows were shattered. The school sign hung crookedly, covered in graffiti. And yet, as Laura stepped onto the cracked pavement, She felt the ghosts of what had happened here. The place where she had last seen her daughter. The place where everything had gone wrong. A single light flickered inside the building. Someone was waiting for her. Her hands clenched into fists. She took a deep breath, then stepped inside. The hallway was dark, the air stale with dust and decay. Her footsteps echoed as she moved toward the faint glow of the light. Then, a voice, soft, whispered, broken. "You shouldn't have come." Laura froze. She turned slowly, and there she was, Audrey. She stood in the shadows, her eyes filled with terror. "You need to run," Audrey whispered. Laura's chest tightened. "Why?" she whispered back. Audrey's eyes darted behind her. Laura followed her gaze, and that's when she saw them. Silhouettes moving in the darkness. More than one. More than two. People were coming, and they weren't here to talk. Laura's blood turned to ice. She had walked into a trap. And now it was too late to run. The trap. Surrounded by shadows. Laura's pulse roared in her ears. The abandoned school hallway was suffocating. The walls pressing in, the flickering light casting twisted shadows on the peeling paint. This was a trap. Audrey stood frozen, her wide eyes darting behind Laura. She wasn't alone. Slowly, so painfully slowly, Laura turned her head. Silhouettes. Figures emerging from the dark, silent, predatory. Their presence was a whisper against her skin, an unspoken promise of what was coming. 1, 2, 3, 4. They had been waiting for her. The cold realization sank in. They knew she would come. They wanted her here, and she had walked right into their hands. Laura swallowed, forcing herself to remain calm. "Who are they?" she whispered to Audrey. The younger woman's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her body was rigid, trembling. One of the men stepped forward. Tall, broad shoulders, a face hidden in the shadows. Then he spoke. "Mrs. Calloway," he said smoothly, his voice familiar. Too familiar. Laura stiffened. That voice, it sent chills down her spine. Then he stepped fully into the light, and her stomach dropped. Principal Lillian Brooks' brother. Nathaniel Brooks, a man who had once been a philanthropist, a school board leader, a man who had spoken at the memorial services for the missing children, shedding crocodile tears while assuring grieving parents that everything possible was being done. A man who had lied. "Oh my God," Laura breathed. Nathaniel smiled, slow and cold. "You always were persistent." Laura's stomach twisted. "You," she whispered. "You were part of this." He chuckled, shaking his head. Laura, do you think things like this happen by accident?" Her blood turned to ice. It had been bigger than she ever imagined. Nathaniel Brooks hadn't just been part of this. He had orchestrated it. Laura's breath shuddered. "Why?" Nathaniel sighed. "Because people pay for what they want. And unfortunately for you, 27 years ago, someone with a lot of money wanted those children." Laura felt like she might be sick. She had suspected trafficking. She had feared it for years. But now she was standing face to face with the man who had made it happen. Nathaniel smirked, taking a step forward. "Now, Laura, let's have a chat." Secrets they never wanted found. Laura knew she couldn't show fear, even though every fiber of her being screamed at her to run. She forced herself to stand tall. "Where is my daughter?" she demanded. Nathaniel sighed. "You're still on that." He gave a small, lazy shrug. "It's been 27 years. I think it's time to let it go." The rage came first, then the fear. Laura's voice turned to steel. She was on that list. "I saw the files. She was sold." Nathaniel's smirk widened. Yes, she was. The words nearly knocked the breath out of her. A part of her had still hoped that maybe Rory had escaped, survived, somehow. But no. Nathaniel was confirming the truth like it meant nothing. Laura's hands clenched into fists. I'm going to kill him. She took a step forward. Where is she? Nathaniel gave a long, dramatic sigh. Laura, I'm not going to give you answers just because you ask nicely. A pause. Then his smile sharpened. But maybe I'll give you something. He gestured to Audrey. Ask her. Laura's breath caught. She turned to Audrey. The younger woman was trembling. Nathaniel smirked. Go on, Audrey. Tell her. Laura's heart pounded. What is he talking about? She asked. Audrey wouldn't meet her eyes. Tell her, Nathaniel pressed. Audrey's lips quivered. She looked tortured, broken. Then, finally, she whispered. I saw Rory. Laura's knees nearly buckled. Her breath caught in her throat. What? She gasped. Audrey's hands clenched into fists. After they took us, I saw her. She fought back. Laura's stomach twisted. What happened to her? Audrey hesitated. Then, voice shaking, she whispered. She never made it out of Mexico. The words hit Laura like a freight train. Mexico. The children had been smuggled across the border. And Rory. She hadn't survived. Laura's hands shook. The grief hit her like a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. All these years, all this searching, and now she knew. Rory was gone. Tears burned in her eyes, but she forced them back. She wasn't going to break. Not yet. Nathaniel was watching her with amusement. Now you know, he said smoothly. So, what will you do with it? Laura's breathing was ragged. She couldn't fall apart. Not now. Not when she was this close to the truth. She lifted her chin. I'm going to destroy you, she said softly. Nathaniel chuckled. Oh, Laura, that's adorable. He took a step forward, his smile turning razor sharp. You think you're in control here. The men behind him shifted slightly, their presence a silent threat. You walked into my building, Nathaniel said. I decide who leaves. The words sent ice through Laura's veins. She knew what he meant. She wasn't leaving this place alive. Unless she fought. The escape. It happened in a blink. Laura moved fast. She grabbed a rusted metal chair from the corner of the room and swung. The chair slammed into Nathaniel, knocking him back. Audrey screamed. Chaos erupted. Laura didn't wait. She ran. Footsteps thundered behind her. She sprinted through the dark, crumbling hallways, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. Think, think, think. The old gym. It had a back exit. She veered left and barreled straight through the doors. The exit was there, just feet away. But then, a gunshot. Bang! Pain exploded in her shoulder. Laura cried out, stumbling. But she didn't stop. She slammed through the exit, into the cold night air. Blood dripped down her arm. Footsteps pounded behind her. They were chasing her. Then, screech. A car skidded into view. The door flew open. Get Helen. Laura didn't hesitate. She dived into the passenger seat. Helen slammed the gas pedal. Tires screamed. Nathaniel Brooks and his men vanished into the distance. And Laura was alive. But she knew one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The reckoning. The getaway. Helen's car swerved violently as she sped down the highway, tires screeching against the pavement. Laura clutched her bleeding shoulder, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the abandoned school grew smaller in the rearview mirror. They had made it out, but not unscathed. You're bleeding, Helen gasped, glancing over at her. I'm fine, Laura panted, though the fire spreading through her arms said otherwise. Drive. Just drive. Helen slammed her foot on the gas. The night blurred past. Laura's mind was spinning. Nathaniel Brooks, the man who had orchestrated the sale of their children. He had planned to silence her, and now he would know that she had escaped. We can't go home, Laura said suddenly. Helen tightened her grip on the wheel. I know. They'll be looking for us. I know, Helen repeated, her voice tense. Laura took a deep breath, ignoring the pain lancing through her arm. We have to end this, she whispered. Helen didn't hesitate. How? Laura's eyes hardened. We burned them to the ground. The fight for truth. By dawn, they were holed up in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. Helen patched up Laura's shoulder with a first aid kit she had grabbed from a gas station. Laura barely flinched. Her mind was focused on one thing: destroying everyone who had been part of this. She flipped open her phone and dialed. A voice answered on the second ring. Officer Jensen. It's Laura, she said, her voice like steel. Silence. Then, Jesus Christ, where are you? Laura ignored the question. I have proof. Real proof. Financial records, names, everything. A pause. Then Jensen's voice dropped, low and serious. Meet me, but not at the station. Too many eyes. Where? There's a truck stop off Route 19. Back parking lot. 30 minutes. Laura nodded. I'll be there. She hung up. Helen was staring at her. Do you trust him? Laura hesitated. Then, I don't trust anyone, but he's our best shot. The final betrayal. 30 minutes later, Laura and Helen pulled into the truck stop. The sun was rising, spilling golden light over the empty lot. A single car was parked near the back. Jensen stepped out. Laura gripped the folder of evidence, taking a steadying breath. This was it. Jensen raised his hands in surrender as they approached. You made it, he said. Yeah, Laura said. Barely. Jensen eyed the blood staining her sleeve. His jaw tightened. You're in deep, Calloway. You should have let this go. Laura's grip on the folder tightened. You knew, she accused. You knew what happened to our kids. And you did nothing. Jensen's expression flickered. Guilt. Then he exhaled. Yeah, he admitted. I knew. Laura froze. Helen's eyes widened. Jensen sighed, running a hand down his face. You think this case went cold by accident, he said bitterly. We had leads. We had suspects. But every time we got close, someone higher up shut us down. And if we pushed back, we disappeared too. Laura's stomach twisted. You let them get away with it, she whispered. Jensen's face was grim. I survived, he corrected. And so did you. For now. A beat of silence. Then, Jensen reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. Helen gasped. Laura's blood turned to ice. Jensen cocked his head. Hand me the folder, Calloway. Laura's breath hitched. No. Jensen sighed. Don't make this difficult. You son of a bitch, Helen spat. Jensen didn't even look at her. Laura, he said. Be smart. Laura stared him down. She had trusted no one. And she had been right. Jensen was part of it. And now he was here to clean up his mess. Laura's mind raced. She glanced around. The lot was empty. The highway was too far away. They were alone. No help was coming. They were on their own. Then, suddenly, a gunshot. Jensen staggered, his face contorting in shock. He dropped his gun. Laura spun. Helen was holding a pistol. Her hands were shaking. But her aim had been perfect. Jensen collapsed, blood spreading across his shirt. Helen's breath was ragged. Laura moved fast, grabbing the fallen gun. She aimed it at Jensen. He coughed, his body twitching. Then he looked up, blood on his lips, and smiled. You're too late, he rasped. Laura's stomach turned. What do you mean? Jensen chuckled. You think this is over? He coughed again. Brooks is just a pawn. The real men in charge. They'll come for you. Laura's hands shook. They'll clean this up, Jensen continued. His voice was getting weaker. And no one will remember your little crusade. Laura's jaw clenched. "No," she said. "They won't. Because I'm going to make sure the whole damn world knows." Jensen's smile faltered. Laura took a slow step forward. Then, she pulled out her phone. She turned the screen toward Jensen and hit play. His own voice filled the air. "You think this case went cold by accident. We had leads. We had suspects. But every time we got close, someone higher up shut us down. And if we pushed back, we disappeared too." Jensen's face twisted in horror. You recorded." Laura's smirk was cold. "Yeah," she whispered. Jensen's eyes darkened. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed. Laura's voice turned to steel. "Neither do they." Then she turned and walked away. The truth goes viral. By noon, the video had spread like wildfire. It was on every news channel, every social media platform. Nathaniel Brooks. The missing children. The truth. The world finally knew. The police were forced to act. Nathaniel Brooks was arrested. More names came out. Judges, politicians, businessmen. A powerful human trafficking ring had been hiding in plain sight, and now it was falling apart. But for Laura, there was no victory. No true justice. Her daughter was gone. She stood in front of Rory's empty grave, tears sliding down her cheeks. Helen stood beside her. "You did it," Helen whispered. Laura swallowed hard. "No," she said. "I didn't." She knelt down, pressing her palm against the cold stone. "I just made them pay." The wind blew softly through the cemetery. For the first time in 27 years, Laura felt free, and so did the ghosts of the past. Justice in the shadows. The storm after the fire. The world had exploded. Laura sat in the dimly lit motel room, her laptop open, her phone vibrating nonstop with notifications. The truth was out. The video of Jensen's confession had gone viral in a matter of hours. Every major news outlet had picked it up. The headlines screamed the truth that had been buried for nearly 3 decades. A like trafficking ring exposed in missing children case. Former principal, school board officials, and wealthy investors under investigation. 27-year-old cold case unravels. Is this just the beginning? And the world was listening. Nathaniel Brooks had been arrested. His assets had been frozen. His political allies were scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. But Laura knew this wasn't over. Jensen had warned her. Brooks was just a pawn. The real men in charge, the ones who had ordered the abduction and sale of the children, were still out there. And they wouldn't go down without a fight. Helen paced the room, her arms crossed. "You know they're coming, right?" she murmured. Laura exhaled, rubbing her temples. "I know." Helen stopped, turning to her. "Then why aren't you scared?" Laura looked up, her eyes cold. "Because I've been living in fear for 27 years. I'm tired of being scared." Helen hesitated, then nodded. "You should leave town," she said softly. "Disappear before they retaliate." But Laura shook her head. "If I run, they win." A tense silence stretched between them. Then Helen sighed. "Then we fight." The final move. By nightfall, the weight of what they had done settled over them. The world knew the truth. But justice was slow, and powerful men had long arms. Laura and Helen had barricaded themselves in the motel, checking the locks twice. A single misstep could cost them everything. Then, a knock on the door. Both women froze. Laura reached for the stolen pistol sitting on the nightstand. Helen's fingers tightened around a metal flashlight, her knuckles white. Another knock. Then, a voice. "It's me." Laura recognized it instantly. Audrey. Laura rushed to the door, unbolting it quickly. Audrey stepped inside, her hood pulled over her head, her body wrapped in an oversized jacket. She was shaking. "You need to leave town," Audrey said immediately. "Right now." Laura frowned. "Why?" Audrey's hands trembled. Because you weren't supposed to survive that night at the school. Laura's stomach turned to ice. They wanted to silence you, and you escaped. Audrey continued, her voice urgent. And now they're sending someone else. Helen's breath hitched. Who? Audrey hesitated. Then she whispered a name that sent a dagger through Laura's spine. The benefactor. The room fell silent. Laura stared at her. Who? Audrey swallowed hard. He's the one who paid for all of us. The one who made it all happen. Nathaniel was just the middleman. A deep, awful realization settled over Laura. Someone bigger than Nathaniel had been behind this, and that someone was still free. Audrey took a shaky breath. Nathaniel protected him. But now that Nathaniel's been arrested, the benefactor has nothing left to lose. Laura's fingers clenched into fists. Where is he? Audrey's gaze darkened. He's coming for you. And when he finds you, he won't make the same mistake Nathaniel did. A cold dread slithered down Laura's spine. But she didn't waver. She met Audrey's eyes and said the only thing that mattered. Then let's take him down first. Hunting the hunter. They had one shot. The benefactor was powerful, untouchable, a ghost in the system. But he had made a mistake. He was coming for them. And Laura had learned something very important in the last 27 years. Desperate men made mistakes. Audrey, Helen, and Laura piled into the car, hearts pounding as they drove through the darkened streets. Their plan was simple: get to him before he got to them. Audrey had overheard Nathaniel talking before he was arrested. The benefactor was in town, hiding in one of his safe houses, and they were going to force him out. By the time they arrived at the abandoned mansion on the edge of town, the night was thick and silent. The house loomed before them, an old estate, its windows dark. "Are you sure this is it?" Helen whispered. Audrey nodded. Laura exhaled, gripping her pistol tightly. "Then let's finish this." The face of a monster. The mansion was silent. Too silent. The air inside was stale, the floor creaking under their weight. And then, a voice. "I was wondering when you'd come." The shadows shifted, and a man stepped into the dim light. He was older, late 60s, with graying hair and an air of wealth. But his eyes were soulless. Laura's breath hitched. Helen's grip tightened on the flashlight. Audrey took a step back. The benefactor smiled. "I always admired your determination, Mrs. Calloway." Laura raised her gun. "Where's Rory?" she demanded. The man sighed. "Dead," he said, like the rest. Rage blinded her. She pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. Her blood froze. The benefactor laughed. "You didn't think I'd let you walk in here armed, did you?" The trap had been set. Suddenly, gunfire. Helen screamed. Laura ducked, grabbing Audrey. Then, a second shot. The benefactor staggered. Blood bloomed on his chest. Laura turned and saw Audrey holding the gun, shaking, tears streaming down her face. The benefactor fell. Audrey dropped the gun, collapsing to her knees. Laura rushed forward, grabbing her, pulling her close. "It's over," Laura whispered. Audrey sobbed. It was finally over. Justice in the dark. By morning, the police were there. The benefactor was dead. The evidence Laura had leaked had ignited a firestorm. More arrests were made. The trafficking ring that had existed in the shadows for decades was shattered. And Laura was free. For the first time in 27 years, she stood in front of Rory's empty grave, the weight on her chest finally gone. She would never hold her daughter again. She would never get her back. But she had done what she promised. She had found the truth. She had made them pay. Helen placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. Laura exhaled, her heart steady for the first time in decades. "Yeah," she said softly. And then she turned and walked away, leaving the ghosts of the past behind.